Good day. The crisis in the Middle East continues, and we now have further confirmation of Israeli military activities within the Gaza Strip area, with the Israelis sending troops and tanks to cut main roads, and much discussion about Israeli actions, including a report that the Israelis were successful in liberating one of the hostages who apparently was a captured Israeli soldier. So clearly, military activities are taking place, and the Israelis are now active on the ground. They continue to bomb Gaza intensively, and Hamas, for its part, also continues to fire rockets into Israel. The death toll in Gaza continues to rise. Various agencies, not just the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is, of course, controlled by Hamas, but various other agencies continue to report extremely high casualties amongst the civilian population in Gaza. And I should say that for my part, I've received many very detailed discussions and descriptions from various people, discussions, I should say, especially commentaries, about the nature of the fighting that is taking place in Gaza between the Israeli troops there and the Hamas fighters. Now, I read with great interest all of these accounts, and I'm grateful for them. Ultimately, what goes on in street fighting in Gaza, in the tunnel network, in Gaza, those kind of things, this does matter. I have said already, made clear my own belief that in the event that this whole situation were able to play out indefinitely, that Israel had an unlimited amount of time, it would be beyond doubt that the Israelis would prevail in this fighting. Their troops are clearly much better trained than the Hamas fighters are. They've got an overwhelming preponderance of firepower. We've seen that happen with the fact that whilst Israeli bombs do inflict very significant damage on Gaza, the Hamas rockets strikes, so far as I can see, are proving to be largely ineffective, even when these rockets manage to get through. So there is an overwhelming preponderance of military force on the Israeli side. And I get to say something further. I believe that there is still, despite many things that I've said about the fact that the Israeli military does not have the superiority over the Arab states that it used to have in 1967 and 1973, that there's been a significant atrophy in Israeli capabilities, and that the overwhelming success that Israel achieved during the Six-Day War in 1967 could not be replicated today. Nonetheless, there's no doubt at all, at least in my mind, that Israel remains more than capable of defending itself in the face of any Arab attack, and that it still has a clear-cut superiority over any army of any particular Arab state. I think it's a point which I want to perhaps make clear. Man for man, perhaps, possibly, some Arab armies now could possibly match the bulk of Israel's fighters, the reservists and people of that kind. But Israel, of course, has armored forces, an extremely powerful air force, intelligence apparatus, command and control systems, submarines, missiles, a whole package of weapons, and I'm not even including here the nuclear weapons, which, well, Arab states Middle East states, states like Iran and Turkey, can perhaps match or equal Israel, or surpass Israel perhaps even, in some parts of this overall package. But I don't think they can equal Israel in the totality of it. I think that Israel still has that margin of military superiority that's decreased considerably, probably even by comparison with, say, the Lebanon War of 1982. But it's not, maybe it may no longer be quite what it was, but still Israel has this preponderance. So if the war in Gaza were to continue indefinitely and Israel were allowed to take whatever steps it needed to take militarily in order to achieve some kind of victory, some kind of total victory in Gaza, probably in time, in fact, I have no doubt that in time it would do so. But time is the factor, and it always needs to be said, and this is a point which I have made many times, that war, if it is to be conducted successfully, always remains ultimately a political activity. And in terms of this particular conflict, the underlying factor is time. Time is the single thing that works most to the advantage of Hamas, least of all to the advantage of Israel. The longer the war goes on, the more stresses within Israeli society will increase. And by the way, I've been struck by the diversity of opinion and the sophistication of the debates within Israel, which I have to say seem to me well ahead of what I find in many Western countries, in the media of many Western countries. But anyway, the stresses on Israel will grow. The economic stresses on Israel will grow. Again, I've had people point out to me that Israel has a well-run economy, a relatively low debt to GDP ratio. It's 60% of GDP, apparently. Well, that may seem low today by comparison with what we see in Europe, in the United States. It would not have seemed low in the West, say, 15 years ago. But never mind. Israel may indeed have an advanced, sophisticated, relatively well-run economy, but it remains a relatively small country of around 10 million people, of whom I believe 8 million are Jewish, others who are Arabs and Druze. Perhaps they're less committed to the state of Israel than its Jewish population is. But anyway, it is a relatively small country. Its production capacity is limited. It does not have its own vast pool of natural resources, iron, copper, lithium, all of the things that go together to make up the needs of a war economy. It can be, of course, provided by these things, by its allies, but much of some of that will inevitably come at a price. And as Ukraine is currently finding out, excessive dependence on outsiders is not ultimately an effective way to run a war economy in a prolonged war. And as I have said previously, in the wars where Israel has been successful, it has been able to win its wars quickly. A long, prolonged war ultimately will cause stresses politically and socially within Israel itself, especially as casualty figures start to mount, which inevitably they will. It will cause stresses economically. It will deepen divisions, political divisions, including between the political leaders and the military. And, of course, it will increasingly cause strain to Israel's alliances whilst consolidating global opposition to itself. So Israel at the moment, at the start of this military operation, is perhaps as strong as it is ever likely to be. As the weeks and months pass, the political calculus will start to shift, and its position diplomatically, politically, economically may start to grow weaker. Now, I make all of this because, again, I've been reading these commentaries by people who've been explaining to me Israel's military tactics, its advantages over Hamas, the higher training of its soldiers, the better organization that the Israelis have, the weaknesses, the many weaknesses that Hamas also has. But the problem faced by all of this is that though Israel does undoubtedly possess all of these advantages, it seems to me that for the moment they're not advancing fast enough to be able to capitalize on these advantages in a way that will work in terms of the political clock. Now, I say that because we've had more events, much more diplomatic action taking place. Of course, already we've seen the political fault lines begin to grow, but there's been more political action taking place, diplomatic action, and again, the focus has moved back to the Security Council. And we can see increasingly how the Security Council is now dividing between the BRICS states, which are clearly all now coordinating with each other, and Israel and its supporters, primarily the United States and Britain, which, however, are starting to lose, are becoming increasingly isolated on the Security Council, and who just suffered a significant, though not yet decisive, defeat in the General Assembly. Now, there has been another meeting of the Security Council. This meeting was convened at the request of China and the United Arab Emirates. Now, the first meeting of the Security Council in this sequence was called by the Russians, who put together a draft resolution which failed. The US and the Western powers voted it down. Most countries on the Security Council abstained, and the Russian resolution failed to carry. Then Brazil made the second attempt, and of course Brazil is a BRICS state, and there's been telephone conversations between Putin and the Brazilian president, President Lula, and the Russian readout of that conversation confirmed that the Russians and the Brazilians are coordinating with each other. And that resolution also failed, but it failed in a way that was very uncomfortable for the United States. Only the United States vetoed the Brazilian resolution, which voted against the resolution and was forced to veto it. All the other states either supported this resolution or abstained, and that included key allies of the United States like Britain. Then the US tried to claw back ground by proposing its own resolution, which spoke of vaguely conceived temporary humanitarian pauses. The Russians then proposed simultaneously a counter-resolution. Both of these resolutions went to the Security Council. The Russians vetoed, the Russians and the Chinese vetoed the American draft, as they were expected to do. Support, however, for the US weakened. Support for the Russian counter-resolution increased, especially by comparison with the voting on the first Russian resolution in the sequence. And then, of course, the next move was for the Arab states to propose a resolution calling for a ceasefire at the General Assembly, and the country that proposed the resolution was Jordan, but all the Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, some of which now, of course, have diplomatic relations with Israel, they all supported the resolution. And as I've discussed in previous programs, that resolution, the Jordanian resolution, which was put to the General Assembly, more closely mirrored the original Russian draft in that it failed to condemn Hamas, whereas the subsequent Brazilian and Russian draft resolutions, which were put to the Security Council, both did in fact contain condemnations of Hamas, whilst also calling for a ceasefire. Anyway, this resolution, which contained no criticism, no condemnation of Hamas, but which called for a ceasefire, this won a majority in the General Assembly. And the figure has now been updated. It's now apparently 121 countries voted for it, 45 abstained, including most of the US's European allies. 14 countries voted against, including the United States, Israel, and some of the US's allies. And one of the US's most important allies, France, voted in favour of this Jordanian resolution, drafted resolution, as apparently did some other European states also. So this resolution carried, though it is only advisory. Now the UAE and China have come back to the Security Council. And note again that the UAE and China are both BRICS states. We can see how the BRICS states are clearly coordinating and are working together as a team. Now, it is not clear what this particular meeting of the Security Council is going to lead to. By my understanding, the Chinese and the UAE have not put together a proposed draft of a resolution to be placed before the Security Council. But the summary that the UN Secretariat has provided of this meeting shows that it was dominated by reports to the Security Council by UN humanitarian agencies. And they describe a catastrophic situation in Gaza. And we've had reports from Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Middle East, that's UNRWA. We've also had a report from Catherine Russell, Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund. And we've had a further report from Lisa Doughton, Director of the Humanitarian Financing and Resource Mobilization Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And she spoke on behalf of the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, who is currently on mission in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory, or so she said. So these three officials, all UN officials, all members of the Secretariat, all judging from their names from Western countries. I don't know anything about the background of these people. All of them came together and described a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. And they spoke about a breakdown of law and order in Gaza under the pressure of all of this bombing and missile attack and fighting. And they also spoke about the situation in essentially apocalyptic terms. And the opening speaker was the ambassador from Brazil, who talked about the profound sense of urgency and dismay that he felt at the fact that the Security Council was not taking action in the face of these deeply appalling and indefensible by any humane standard in international humanitarian law, the situation where an alarming humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding over our eyes. And then, of course, he was followed by the ambassador of the UAE, another BRICS state, who, of course, was one of the ambassadors who co-sponsored, or rather co-requested, this meeting of the Security Council. And then there was a further meeting, a further comments by the ambassador of China, Zhang Sun, who incidentally spoke in rather more measured terms than some of the other representatives on the Security Council did. And Israel continued to have the support of the United States, though I have to say this support was measured, and it was quite clear that the US ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who, by the way, strikes me as a capable ambassador, I think I should say this. Anyway, she was somewhat on the back foot. She obviously brought up the topic of what Hamas did on the 7th of October, but much of what she appears to have said seems to have been centered upon the United States' actions to ensure that humanitarian relief was indeed provided to Gaza. And then you had comments from Ecuador, country which has supported the United States, talking about the desperate and threatening situation for Gazans. This is the ambassador of Ecuador. You had similar concerns expressed by the ambassador of Switzerland, the ambassador of Gabon. Anyway, the ambassador from Malta spoke about the tragic, gave condolences for the fact that some UN workers have been killed over the course of the fighting. I got the sense altogether that even countries that are normally allies of the United States, representatives from Albania, Malta, France, were all shocked by the information provided by the officials of from these three humanitarian agencies. And of course, these commentaries have not been provided or circulated in much detail in the West, but of course people in the West are hearing about them. There have been protests in the United States now, protests in Britain. There'll be more protests in other European countries. They're being widely spoken about, of course, and circulated across the Middle East. And of course, the Israeli mission at the UN made strong statements on behalf of their country. They spoke about Hamas being Nazis, acting the same way that the Nazis did, about Israel facing an existential threat from Hamas, but they're having to argue against the tide of information that is coming from these officials. And that already is going to make some ambassadors, some representatives, some governments start to have concerns about what Israel is saying, and is going to make the statements of these Israeli officials, these Israeli representatives, it's going to make it more difficult for them to achieve traction. And I have to say, I think that the Israeli delegation to the UN recently, I'm not sure whether it was at the Security Council meeting. Anyway, they attended the Security Council meeting wearing Stars of David, of a kind that was forced upon Jewish people by the Nazis during the Second World War, trying to, I think, emphasize the fact that Israel is facing an existential danger from Hamas. And we've had an extraordinary speech from Prime Minister Netanyahu, again filled with biblical imagery and language taken from the Bible, from the Old Testament, and from Scripture. At least some of the language seemed to echo what is to be found in Scripture. I have to say that I think myself that this display of the Star of David in that kind of way, at a time when all of these reports are coming out from UN officials about a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I think far from winning sympathy from Israel, for Israel, around the world, I think that perhaps in the United States, perhaps in Israel itself, perhaps amongst Jewish people, perhaps amongst many people in Europe, this action by the Israeli delegation will have its effect, will carry traction. But I suspect that in most of the world, it triggers annoyance and irritation. It will make many people, many governments feel that, well, maybe Israel is making those kind of comparisons with the Nazis, between Hamas and the Nazis, and perhaps even these comparisons might even have some force. The language of Hamas's charter, which does call for the destruction of the State of Israel and uses makes some horrendous comments about Jewish people. Well, that is true. But as I said, officials around the world, governments around the world, are probably going to feel that they're in some ways being positioned by Israel as somehow supporters of Hamas and Nazis. And given that what governments around the world are trying to achieve is a ceasefire to prevent civilians being killed, or at least that is what they say, I think they will find this kind of action by Israel frankly infuriating, directed as it is, at least to some extent, not just against Hamas, but against them. At a time when you are already seeing world opinion shift against you, I think making steps of this kind in the UN isn't going to help you. It's going to make that shift against you in global opinion even stronger. Now, of course, once upon a time, none of this would have mattered. If we were in this kind of situation 30, even 20 years ago, the United States then was indisputably the world's most powerful country, the country with the world's biggest economy, the country with the world's most powerful armed forces, the country which dominated the global financial system and which bestrode the world like a colossus. And at that time, ultimately, it was only the opinion of the United States that mattered. I can remember that back in the early 2000s, the US ambassador of the time, John Bolton, even went so far as to say, as far as he was concerned, there was only one country that really ought to be sitting in the UN Security Council, and that was the United States, because none of the other countries on the UN Security Council had any real function or significance. Now, that was, by the way, a most undiplomatic thing for John Bolton to say. and it reflected the arrogance that has got the United States into many of the problems which it faces today. But anyway, never mind. Once upon a time, as I said, Israel, because it had the support of the United States, because it had the support of the key European countries, France, Germany and Britain, it could basically brush off criticism coming from elsewhere. The world, however, today is different. And at a time when Chinese manufacturing has surpassed that of the United States, and where the gulf, the gap between China and the United States in manufacturing is increasing, there's much talk about the rapid growth of the US economy this year. What I think is widely overlooked is that even as GDP growth has been accelerating, along with debt, by the way, and the government's budget deficit, even as GDP growth has been accelerating, industrial production, manufacturing in the United States has actually been in decline. Just say, China, it has had its reverses, but overall the trend there is for it to grow. Again, I'm not going to discuss these economic questions in this program. But anyway, as the world has changed, as the economic, military, and geopolitical balance has shifted, as the United States has become less powerful relative to other countries, it strikes me that acting as if only the opinion of the United States in the end matters, and that Israel, as a result, has unlimited time in Gaza to do what it wishes, I think that is becoming increasingly dangerous and unwise. Anyway, I say all of that. We shall see how things turn out. The New York Times is talking about the secrecy of Israel's military actions in Gaza, about which I agree. As I said, I've noticed all of these comments and commentaries about Israeli military actions. To be frank, I don't think I personally, I'm talking about myself now, have seen enough information to be able to give a clear view, any kind of view, even an inexpert view, which it would be coming from me, about where this military side of the conflict is coming. But it's clear to me that support around the world for Israel, such as it is already weakening, and opposition is growing, and this debate in the Security Council is going to reinforce that trend. Meanwhile, President Putin has made certain comments about the whole situation in the Middle East. Now, this happened at an urgent meeting of the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, I should say, which he convened following the events in Dagestan. I am not going to cover the comments that he made about the situation in Dagestan in any detail. Briefly, Putin blamed what happened in Dagestan on Western intelligence agencies working alongside Ukraine, providing false information to people there, trying to set communities in the Northern Caucasus against each other. And it's quite clear to me that he believes, that he personally, Putin believes, that this was a carefully organized affair. More than just a few Telegram channels were involved. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I'm not going to discuss whether what Putin says is even true. Anyway, this is what he said about the situation in the Middle East. he said, we will discuss the situation in the Middle East and issues related to ensuring law and order in Russia. And he says, as you know, at a recent meeting with religious associations leaders, including, by the way, the chief rabbi of Russia, I spoke about the attempts to use the dramatic situation in the Middle East and other regional conflicts against our country to destabilize and divide our multi-ethnic and multi-faith society. For this purpose, many different means are being used, including, as we see, lies, provocations, and sophisticated techniques of psychological and information aggression. And then he comes to the rub. I want to repeat that those behind the Middle East conflict and other regional conflicts will be using the destructive impact of these conflicts to sow hatred and cause clashes between people around the world. This is the real self-serving aim of such geopolitical puppeteers. We remember how the current phase of the Middle East crisis began. It was a terrorist attack against Israeli civilians and civilians from other countries who happened to be in Israel at that time. So you see, Putin clearly defines the original Hamas attack as terrorist. But then he goes on to say this. We see that, unfortunately, instead of punishing criminals and terrorists, they, and he's careful not to reference Israel specifically, they started to retaliate according to the principle of collective responsibility. There is no justification for the terrible events taking place in Gaza now, where hundreds of thousands of innocent people are being killed indiscriminately without having anywhere to flee or hide from the bombing. When you see blood-stained children, dead children, and the suffering of women and old people, when you see medics killed, of course it makes you clench your fists as tears well in your eyes. There is no other way to put it. However, we have no right, and we cannot allow ourselves to be carried away by emotions. I have repeatedly said that the danger in a lot of the actions which have been taken first and foremost by Israel in this matter, and also by the United States and other countries in response to what has happened on the 7th of October. A lot of the actions that have been taken are being driven by emotional anger. We see how Putin himself is warning against this. And of course, that is consistent with the discipline with which he has responded to various actions that has been taken over the course of the conflict in Ukraine. The shelling of Donetsk city, the various assassinations that have taken place within Russia, the responsibility for which an article in the Washington Post has again said rests with Ukraine, but he has shown emotional self-control, self-discipline in response to this. Putin is essentially saying that the other side, the Israelis, have not shown that same self-control and self-discipline, which they needed to, and he is warning Russians, the rest of the world, also to exercise self-control and self-discipline in response to what is happening in Gaza. He's basically telling the Iranians, Hezbollah, the Arab states, don't take actions in anger, potentially expanding the war, which you may one day have cause to regret. And then he goes on to say, we must clearly understand who in reality is behind the tragedy of peoples in the Middle East and in other regions around the world, who has been organizing this lethal chaos and who benefits from it. In my opinion, it has already become clear to everyone as the masterminds brazenly act in the open. And you'll be very unsurprised to learn that the masterminds, in his opinion, are the United States. They are the current ruling elites in the United States and its satellites who are the beneficiaries of the global instability that they use to extract their bloody rent. Their strategy is also clear. The United States as a global superpower is becoming weaker and is losing its position, and everyone sees and understands this, even judging by the trends in the world economy. The American-style world, with the hegemony of one country, is being destroyed and is receding gradually, but inexorably into the past. However, the United States is unwilling to accept this and instead seeks to preserve and extend its dominance, its global dictatorship, which is easier to achieve amid such chaos. The United States believes chaos will help it contain and destabilize its rivals, or as they put it, their geopolitical opponents, among which they also rank our country. Now, I'm going to say actually that for once, I think Putin is probably overstating things. I mean, if you follow the line of reasoning that he's adopting here, the United States has been pulling all the strings and is somehow behind even the events that took place on the 7th of October, the original Hamas attack on Israel. I myself take a different view. I've seen no evidence that the US was directly involved in that attack by Hamas on southern Israel. I think that if that is the impression that Putin is seeking to convey, he is overstating the position. But I wonder whether, reading these words, Putin isn't also perhaps trying to give some advice to Israel, telling the Israelis, I understand your anger, I understand your grief, but what you're doing in Gaza is wrong and is ultimately a mistake, and ultimately you are being manipulated by the Americans who want to create chaos around the world and who have for a long time now been using and manipulating you, and who, behind the words of support they give you, are ultimately the people who are responsible for all your problems. And of course, you can take strong issue with some of that. I do, by the way, was part of it myself. But it is a way, perhaps, that Putin is preparing, and I feel with Putin that everything he says is carefully thought through in advance. It is perhaps a way for Putin to discuss things with the Israelis, to try to persuade the Israelis to change their stance, to change their policy, whilst making it easier for them by suggesting to them that they have been the dupes of the people that Putin is referring to, the elites of the United States. Anyway, there's an interesting set of comments, but one can see how Putin is himself responding to this crisis. He is under pressure in Russia. He has a large Muslim population within Russia to consider. He has historically been strongly philo-Semitic. I think most people who know Putin would acknowledge this. He's been a friend of Israel in many respects, and he is deeply hostile to Islamic terrorism. But he has gradually shifted gears in the face of this crisis. I think that he is representing and, to a great extent, articulating the current trends and shifts in global opinion. And we see that most of the world increasingly is following with what he says. Well, we will see what the next steps, what next happens in the Security Council and in the United Nations. This has been, by the way, the most substantive and interesting debate in the Security Council by far up to now. The previous moves in the Security Council have been, in my opinion, opening skirmishes. This meeting, with the representations made by the UN officials, was of a completely different character. And perhaps a further attempt will be made on the back of this meeting to present another resolution to the Security Council calling for a ceasefire. We shall see. But sooner or later, as I said, the weight of opinion calling for a ceasefire is going to become overwhelming. Europe is already showing, there are already clear signs of cracks in Europe. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, that is already having some effect on the political steps, the actions taken by the United States. Well, that is my discussion of the situation in the Middle East today. We are now at that stage where there's ongoing fighting in Gaza, which some reports suggest could go on for weeks and months and even a year. But we already see how the Security Council, how the diplomacy on the Security Council in the United Nations is starting to shift, and how these moves, step by step, until we eventually get that overwhelmingly strong resolution carried either by the General Assembly, maybe under the United for Peace formula, or conceivably on the Security Council itself, which imposes the ceasefire, how we're moving step by step, incrementally, ever closer to that position. Anyway, there's been a lot going on in the situation in Ukraine. And the first thing to say is that I have seen for the first time an admission by a respected and highly regarded Western reporter and journalist, Neil Hauer, that the Ukrainian offensive, the summer offensive, has been a strategic failure. And this reporter, Neil Hauer, who has been for some time, I believe, based in Armenia. I'm not sure whether he's there more at the moment, but he's written for journals like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. He's also, I believe, written for other mainstream media outlets like The Guardian, the CNN, all kinds of places. At least he's appeared on CNN. Anyway, he is somebody who, as I said, cannot be in any way dismissed as a marginal figure. And he straightforwardly speaks out about the realities, about the situation in Ukraine and the failure of the Ukrainian offensive. And this he all said on X. I'm just going to read some of the things that he said. He says, almost 5 full months into Ukraine's counteroffensive, with action winding down, I think it's safe to say it has been a serious failure. The overarching goal was to liberate a large amount of territory, including the cities of Tokmak and Melitopol, and this has not happened. The strikes on the Black Sea and Crimea are nice, but they have no relation to the gains or total lack of them on the ground. And then he says, he goes on to say that the biggest issue is ammunition. There was an enormous amount of artillery ammunition, especially bought from South Korea, but also concentrated from other countries. And this was put together specifically for this offensive. That's gone now, and very likely won't be replaced for a full year. Ask any Ukrainian serviceman, as I have repeatedly on frontline visits in Donbass and Zaporozhye for the past year and a half, and they will tell you ammunition is the biggest issue. They had a lot for this offensive, and it won't be repeated soon, and goals weren't achieved. So, admission, it was a failure. And incidentally, he talks about shortages of ammunition. I've been saying that. Brian Beletic has been talking about that in much more detail than me. There's been an enormous amount of discussion about these ammunition shortages. And way back in the spring and summer, I said that I remember saying that the 500,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition that South Korea was purportedly loaning to the United States, that was actually a device to get those shells to Ukraine in advance of the offensive. And we see that that is exactly what happened. The United States had run through its stocks of ammunition even before the offensive began. It bulked out its supplies of 155 millimeter ammunition to Ukraine by buying, in fact, ammunition from South Korea. And all that ammunition was shipped to Ukraine, and that was the ammunition that Ukraine largely used up, along with the other 300,000 shells it got from the European Union, and of course some shells that it also got from the United States in order to conduct the offensive. I suspect it started the offensive with 1 million shells, 155 million shells overall. That was my guesstimate. I suspect that that is correct. And now that stockpile has all but run out, and we see the results. Nothing has been achieved of significance on the battlefronts. In his thread on X, Neil Hauer has provided a map which shows small indentations in the Russian positions. And as I've discussed in many places, contrary to repeated claims, going all the way back to August, Ukraine has not managed to pierce the Surovikin line in any single place. And anyway, contrary to those claims, small indentations, Ukrainian able to advance principally into the grey zone, into areas that are part of Russia's overall zone of control. It's managed to carve out for itself a salient in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, but with every single day, one gets more reports of more Ukrainian soldiers being killed and wounded there in large numbers. And I've discussed in various programs recently the devastating losses the Ukrainian Air Force has suffered over the last couple of weeks, the devastating losses Ukraine's artillery has been suffering over the last couple of weeks, apparently as Russian drone warfare becomes ever more sophisticated. And there appears to be a similar massacre underway of what is left of Ukraine's Western-supplied tank force. There's been a whole series of pictures and films now of more Leopard 2 tanks destroyed on the battlefronts. And Yan Gagin, the advisor of Denis Pushilin, is now making critical comments about the Leopard 2. He says it's too heavy, its armor isn't particularly good, it's difficult to maintain on the front lines. It's not really up to the rigors of Ukrainian conditions. It has to be hauled back to the rear to be repaired, and that's extremely difficult. And in fact, I believe there's even one photograph which shows two Leopard 2 tanks, both knocked out by Russian fire. It seems what happened was that one Leopard 2 tank was knocked out. The Ukrainians tried to retrieve it by sending another Leopard 2 to pull it back to the rear, and that Leopard 2 then promptly got knocked out as well. So, major disaster on the battlefronts, admissions from, as I said, a very well-regarded mainstream Western journalist that things are not going well for Ukraine on the battlefronts. That, as I have been saying for weeks now, Ukraine's counter-offensive this summer and autumn has been a strategic defeat and a strategic victory for Russia. And interestingly, we're starting to get reports about the demoralization that this is starting to cause in Ukraine's army. And there's been an interesting article about this from Business Insider. It says, on Ukraine's front lines, soldiers show steely determination, but they also experience burnout, depression, divorce, and a lot of PTSD. And this is all based on a trip by Melinda Herring, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, essentially the NGO arm, I would say, of NATO. That's my own spin. It's a Washington-based think tank. It is fervently supportive of Ukraine. And of course, Herring has met soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, and of course she says that they are flinty and steely and determined. But then she goes on to admit, when you talk to them for more than 5 minutes, they'll tell you that there is frustration. They have only get about 30 days leave each year. Most of them have barely seen their families. They're very angry about the fact that in Kiev itself, a lot of people are still living lives as if there wasn't a war going on, and they're the soldiers on the battlefronts are resentful of this. They're also becoming resentful of Ukraine's Western allies. And this is again a quote from Herring. When I was talking to soldiers on the front line, they did say overall the mood was one of determination, but also we can't keep doing this with our air power. You can't ask us to do this. You can't ask us to fight in a way you wouldn't fight yourself. They're very eager for air power. And then she talks about the staggering losses Ukraine has suffered. She gives American figures for these losses, which I don't actually accept. But anyway, I think they're much higher than she admits. But then she admits that this toll is felt on the front lines. Those who survived the fighting thus far are eager for it to end, albeit not at any cost. One thing that I was surprised with is we have these intricate debates about what is victory. But when you go and talk to soldiers, they just want to go home. They want peace and they want to go home. And she goes on to say that they're unwilling to give up their land and their territory. The fight for them is existential. If they stop fighting, they will lose their homelands and they will lose their lives. That's what she also hears them say. But they're tired, they're exhausted, they want a normal, stable, safe life. So that doesn't sound as if they're full of optimism. They clearly don't believe that they're winning. They're tired, they're exhausted, they long for the war to end. They're obviously being told by their officers, and this is an important thing people always overlook when they see discussions between Western journalists and soldiers. They don't want to give the impression ever that they've given up the battle, but nonetheless, they can't conceal the fact that they're tired, exhausted, and they want to go home. Now, that's in Business Insider. There has been a far more powerful, and in terms of Ukraine, a much more bleak article. It is very long in Time magazine, and it is principally about President Zelensky himself. And we learn how he, at a meeting in Washington, he looked distant and agitated. He looked tired. He complains to Time magazine that nobody believes in our victory like I do. Nobody. It takes all your power, your energy. You understand it takes much of everything. His staff are beginning to become concerned about him. This is all from Time magazine. They say that this is from Time magazine. The usual sparkle of Zelensky's optimism, his sense of humour, his tendency to liven up a meeting in the war room with a bit of banter or a bawdy joke, none of that has survived into the second year of all-out war. Now he walks in, gets the updates, gives the orders and walks out, says one long-time member of his team. Another tells me that, most of all, Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies. They have left him without the means to win the war, only the means to survive it. I think he probably does feel betrayed, but I think it's even more bitter than that. He came very close back in March of last year to agreeing with the Russians a formula for peace. The Western powers, Boris Johnson, President Biden, persuaded him to go back on that. They made him promises of unlimited aid and told him that with that aid he would achieve victory. And what he's looking at is defeat. And that understandably makes him feel bitter. But of course, having been boxed into this position, he can't shift. He still has to continue with the war. And we can see that this is causing many of his team to lose faith in him. And I go back to what Time magazine says. His convictions, Zelensky's convictions, haven't changed despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield. He does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is immovable, verging on the messianic. He deludes himself, one of his closest aides tells me in frustration. We are out of options. We are not winning. But try telling him that. Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's efforts to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they have debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo: the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. And Zelensky rejects that. He remains dead set against even a temporary truce. And he's intent on winning the war on Ukrainian terms And there's again lots of talk about tactics that he's coming up with and his officials are coming up with, but no real clear plan, clearly, as to how that can be done and how this situation can be reversed. Now, I have to say, reading all of these comments, and by the way, also further confirmation in other parts of this article that most of the time Zelensky now lives and works inside an air raid bunker in Kiev. Anyway, all of this, I can't help but say, reminds me of a certain leader of Germany in the last months of the Second World War, who also refused to countenance negotiations with his opponents, also appeared to have a messianic conviction in his and his country's ultimate victory, and who was constantly looking for tactical mechanisms that he could somehow pull out of the hat in order to achieve an increasingly unlikely victory. Now, I don't want to push these analogies too far. I am not in any way suggesting that President Zelensky bears much similarity, or indeed any real similarity, to that leader of Germany of long ago. But I do remember reading, all of us I'm sure have read, descriptions of that German leader in the last weeks and months of the war. And I can't help but, the parallels, reading this article in Time magazine, almost force themselves upon you. And by the way, I can't help but think that the authors of this article in Time magazine and some of the Ukrainian officials who are so concerned about this messianic turn in Zelensky's behavior, I can't help but think that they're starting to mutter with each other and make these comparisons as well. Anyway, that's what I would say about that. And then we read about how the situation is now becoming increasingly difficult, that there are serious worries that Ukraine's energy system is not going to hold up this time through the winter. 3 of the senior officials in charge of dealing with this problem tell me that blackouts would likely be more severe this winter, and the public reaction in Ukraine would not be as forgiving. Last year, people blamed the Russians. This time, they'll blame us for not doing enough to prepare. And nonetheless, in spite of all of this, Zelensky continues with his determination to press on with the war. And unsurprisingly, he is now considering, apparently, major dismissals, sackings of officials and ministers. Before the winter sets in, his aides warned me to expect major changes in their military strategy and a major shake-up in the president's team. At least one minister would need to be fired, along with a senior general in charge of the counter-offensive. Now, the article doesn't tell us who this senior general is, but it's difficult to think that it can be anyone other than Zelensky. So it looks as if Zelensky is indeed, as I have discussed in previous programs, probably on the way out. But then we also get even more disturbing news. We're not moving forward, says one of Zelensky's aides. Some frontline commanders have begun refusing orders to advance, even when they come directly from the office of the president. They just want to sit in the trenches and hold the line, but we can't win a war that way. And so There have been lots of reports in the Russian media space for a long, long time about how Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian units disobey commands from Zelensky and his officials to carry out attacks. Now we have the first confirmation that this is indeed actually happening, and it comes from a Ukrainian official close to Zelensky who has spoken to Time magazine. And Time magazine were clearly concerned about this, so they took it up with a senior military officer, Ukrainian military officer, and then this officer confirmed it as well. He said that some commanders have little choice in second-guessing orders from the top. At one point in early October, in other words, just over the last few weeks, the political leadership in Kiev demanded an operation to retake the city of Gorlovka, and a strategic outpost in eastern Ukraine that the Russians have held and fiercely defended for nearly a decade. Now, I have to say, Gorlovka is indeed close to the front lines, but the Russians are in secure control of it. Ukraine has failed to capture it, well, for at least 10 years, going all the way back to the fighting, well, not at least 10 years, going all the way back to the fighting in 2014. I cannot for the life of me understand how, given the overall failure of the offensive, Zelensky and his officials could seriously believe that this place could be recaptured by Ukraine. And yet it seems that in October they gave this order. And again, going back to that mustachioed gentleman of the 1940s, he too was reputedly giving orders that were increasingly detached from reality. And here we see a case of Zelensky apparently giving precisely such an order. And then the Ukrainian military official tells Time the answer came back in the form of a question. With what? They don't have the men or the weapons. Where are the weapons? Where is the artillery? Where are the new recruits? And we go on to read that in some branches of the military, the shortage of personnel has become even more dire than the deficit in arms and ammunition. One of Zelensky's close aides told me that even if the United States and its allies come through with all the weapons they have pledged, we don't have the men to use them. So, this is a disastrous picture. The article goes on to admit that recruitment is way down, conscription efforts have intensified, but the anti-corruption campaign that Zelensky launched back in August to try to make conscription more efficient has actually backfired. Fired officials proved difficult to replace, in part because the reputation of the draft officers has been tainted. Who wants the job? An officer asks. It's like putting a sign on your back that says corrupt. Problems of corruption across the entire system continues. Zelensky says that this is untrue, but one official who speaks to Time magazine says that corruption remains a massive problem, and he says that the anti-corruption campaign is also having a further effect, that as news of the scandals have spread, the president has given strict orders for his staff to avoid the slightest perception of self-enrichment. Don't buy anything, don't take vacations, just sit at your desk, be quiet and work, one staffer says in characterizing these directives. Some mid-level officials in the administration complain of bureaucratic paralysis and low morale as the scrutiny of their work has intensified. And overall, it looks like a catastrophic situation, one in which it's difficult to see how Zelensky realistically can turn things round, how Ukraine, after its enormous strategic defeat over the course of the summer, can win this war. Now, there has been more bleak news for Ukraine on the battlefronts over the last couple of hours. General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, has now publicly acknowledged that Russia's forces in Bakhmut have been reinforced and that it's the Russians now who are taking back the initiative in the fighting in and around Bakhmut. So it looks as if the attempt to retake Bakhmut has failed. Meanwhile, the news from Avdiivka, this key battle, this place which the London Times said Michael Clark in the London Times was describing a couple of days ago as the crucial place on Ukraine's battlefield, the news continues to be grim. It's not easy to get a full picture of what is happening, but it seems that Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka are now complaining that their losses are mounting, supplies to them are becoming sporadic, and steadily the Russians are advancing to all sorts of places around Avdiivka as they move incrementally to choke Avdiivka off. They're apparently advancing towards a small town called Keramik, which is actually north of Avdiivka. This presumably is to push Ukraine's artillery further away from where it can interfere in the fighting in Avdiivka. Dima at the Military Summary Channel explained the military logic behind these moves. And there are also reports that the Russians are now resuming their gradual advance towards that village of Berdichi, which would further complicate Ukrainian efforts to keep the supplies to Avdiivka moving. So, an operational crisis there. And I have to say that even as there is an atmosphere of gloom and pessimism in Ukraine, the overwhelming sense from the Russians that I get is of growing confidence and optimism. Their forces are building up, their tanks and armoured vehicles and ammunition supplies are improving all the time. They've mastered the art of drone warfare. They're hitting the Ukrainians in every place. And though this war still has some way to go, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the Russians are scenting victory. Now, I'm going to finish with two further points. The first one, which is just a minor one, is that I continue to be, and I make no apology for saying this, somewhat baffled by this whole North Korean aspect of the shell supplies to Russia. Apparently, Russian soldiers have actually shown North Korean shells, and they are apparently in use. I have expressed my own view that probably what happened was that last year the Russians contacted the North Koreans and placed orders with North Korean factories for the supply of shells, and they probably provided some of the raw materials, the chemicals and the steel to enable those shells to be produced. And I suspect that they took steps to strengthen quality control issues. But I wonder whether also the Russians might have made these moves as an implicit warning to South Korea, given that it's clear that South Korea was in discussion for quite a long time about supplying shells to Ukraine. The Russians, by perhaps placing some of these orders for shells with the North Koreans, were signalling to the South Koreans that South Korea's decision to supply shells to Ukraine was endangering the relationship between South Korea and Russia. This is a guess, but this is an intriguing affair, and I do wonder what the full explanations for it are going to turn out to be. But anyway, it is quite clear that the Russians are becoming more confident, talk about freezes and ceasefires and that kind of thing on the battle lines in Ukraine, I think will meet no support, no favour in Russia at the moment. By contrast, there are now reports coming from some Ukrainian channels that Zelensky has been presented with an ultimatum. He has in effect been told by the Western powers that unless he starts negotiations for some kind of ceasefire with the Russians, the support of the West is going to gradually reduce until eventually dwindles to nothing. Now, I don't know whether this is true, but this report from Ukrainian channels, from this Ukrainian Telegram channel, also spoke about a media campaign in the West against Zelensky himself if he didn't heed this ultimatum. And I wonder whether this article in Time is a precursor of that. We have a gloomy Zelensky operating from inside a bunker, increasingly detached from reality, becoming increasingly messianic in his decision-making and his self-belief, and becoming increasingly incapable of making decisions. He comes across, from this article in Time magazine, not so much a Churchill as more like Churchill's opponent. Again, I've made my opinions about that fairly clear. Could this be the first step, the first article preparing us for the day when a decision is made to shift Zelensky out of Bankova, the place where he has his office, in other words, to remove him from the presidency? Could that be what this is all about? Might the talk about sacking Zelensky, which we're also seeing, and these arguments that are now raging between Zelensky and Zelensky, be partly connected with Zelensky's own fears that Zelensky might be positioning himself to take over? Or could it also be the case, which by the way I think is more likely, that the West does want Zelensky out of the way, but it also wants Zelensky out of the way as well? That Zelensky has lost the prestige in the West that he had achieved last year. He's no longer the Napoleon that he was, and that the West is looking to get rid of both of these people at the same time, and is looking around for someone else. Could that be Rustem Umarov, the new defense minister, who was apparently a lead negotiator in the negotiations which took place last year, the ones that failed in Istanbul, but who is said to have the support of the West? All interesting questions, all questions which no doubt will one day produce answers. I'm going to say, in advance of answering those questions, that any games of musical chairs in Kiev are unlikely to impress anyone in Moscow. The Russians have made their position entirely clear. What they want is complete satisfaction of all their demands, which will include a complete reconstruction, not just of Ukraine's government, but of its entire political system. Recognition by Ukraine that all the territories that Russia controls will remain not just under Russian control, but will be recognized as Russian. And neutral status for Ukraine in a manner which today, and I have to say this, will in effect translate into Ukraine's dependency upon Russia. I think that replacing Zelensky with someone else, shuffling around generals, shuffling around political leaders in Kiev, I don't think that is going to be enough to satisfy the Russians, and I think it is time for people in the West to start to understand that. Having said that, if Ukraine is to survive at all, perhaps that recognition needs to take place now, and perhaps logically it should be the Western powers that initiate those negotiations. With the situation in the Middle East being what it is, I doubt that there is any appetite or energy or thought about that in Western capitals at the moment. And I have to say that I can't help but think that things in Ukraine are now moving towards an inexorable conclusion, that there will be no negotiations of any kind, no ceasefire or freeze, and that ultimately it will be the Russians who decide when the war stops and what the terms will be. Well, that's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you all again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop. Go and find yourself all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.